Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. I'm absolutely delighted to be here for our final week of Land Reuse Month, and I'm sure the team behind the scenes who've been working very hard are breathing a bit of a sigh of relief that we're heading towards the end now. But we've got a really fantastic programme ahead of us still this morning. We're going to hear from 3 people in this next session telling us about projects that they've been working on. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion about that and a chat. And we're going to start with David. So David works for North Lanarkshire Council, and he's the Growth Programme Manager with responsibility for delivering North Lanarkshire's Economic Regeneration Delivery Plan, which sounds like a proper good challenge, David. So really glad to hear from you this morning. David's held responsibility for delivering North Lanarkshire's vacant and derelict land fund programme since 2010, so I'm sure the next session will be of interest as well. David, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. If you could maybe put up the presentation, if that's okay. Again, I can't. No. Right, so as just highlighted there, so I'm the Growth Programme Manager for North Lanarkshire Council, and part of my role is in external funding. So again, I've held responsibility for the vacant and derelict land fund for about the last 12 years or so for the council. I mean, we invest quite a lot across both greening projects, business and development and so forth. So, but what I'm focusing on today is the model that we actually have in place for actually developing business land and business space. So if you can move on to the next slide. So we basically deliver our kind of business programme on vacant and derelict land through an arm's length organisation called Fusion Assets. So this was formed in 2006, and basically the kind of seed corn funding came from this, a bit from Scottish Enterprise, and also from the sale of a boots factory in Airdrie. But the role of the company is not just focused on Airdrie, it's actually focused upon the whole of North Lanarkshire, and the role is basically about physical regeneration, particularly around industrial development. So again, there was £4.7 million invested in the company to begin with. As I said, it formed in 2006, but really kind of dormant until about 2011. I think what's kind of keen to highlight is it's actually quite a small company. So until recently, I actually only had 1 full-time member of staff. So most of the the work is actually contracted out. In terms of consultants and so forth, in terms of design and so forth. They brought in a new person quite recently to actually try and accelerate the programme and actually advance the kind of works they're taking forward. So if you can go on to the next slide. Okay, so we have actually set up a kind of joint venture equity model about this. So this isn't just about the council investing money or VDLF. This is about actually the kind of enabling investment that comes around to try and get the private sector involved in relation to investment in the vacant and derelict land sites. So in terms of the kind of model, we use VDLF to basically identify sites, purchase those sites, and get them kind of development ready. So again, we did a lot of work, initially around this in terms of state aids and so forth to make sure that we're in the right place to be able to take this forward. Once we've kind of de-risked that whole project, we then, or Fusion then, go out to try and procure a private sector joint venture partner in this. So their investment comes in terms of the equity in the actual land. So once we've actually got a value in that land to take forward, there's also loan funding in there. So again, they've used private sector, but they've also used spruce, for example. So there's various mechanisms out there, and they're also looking at different monies to come in right now, and then they've also got that kind of company resources. So once that joint venture partner has been procured, And I have to say, to date, that's virtually been, development companies, because they can see money coming in here, not just in terms of their investment, but also in terms of the actual construction work as well. So the construction then goes ahead, and once that's complete, the Fusion assets, and again, as I said, they're quite a small company, so they actually get property and letting agents. They'll come out, let that investment, and then that investment is actually sold on, and the profit is recycled. I think just to the right there, I've kind of highlighted that there is also, additional benefit here. So again, at that very early stage, we're taking that vacant and derelict land, we're making it development ready, which actually means that when grant opportunities, come ahead, then we're able to, or Fusion are able to actually take that forward. So again, through the RCGF, for example, they've got, funding through that. They do the construction through that. And again, in particular around RCGF with a 15-year clawback period on it, they're using that as an ongoing income stream for the company. So again, this is all like really a kind of sustainable company that, it's not really, apart from the VDL investment, it's not supported any other way by the council. Sorry, can you go on to the next slide, please? So again, when you actually look at the corporate structure for Fusion Assets, so it's fully owned, by the council, and it's fully managed by the council. Originally, it was set up, Scottish Enterprise were involved in this, but they've kind of, set us aside in about 2014. But under that, there are joint ventures that have been set up to take forward the construction works. So again, those kind of 4 joint ventures are set up, are identified there. They also have a property development arm, which it has to be said has never actually been used, because all the work that they've actually taken forward has been through the joint ventures. Sorry, next slide, please. So when you look at the inputs and outcomes, so basically we've almost invested £10 million additional money to the £4.7 million initial investment through our VDLF. There's 10 projects which have either been delivered or in delivery. That includes 2 projects which have actually been sold on to the private sector. Again, the outcomes, are really good in terms of, space actually created and additional GVA into the economy. I think what's probably really, I'd quite like to highlight here is that basically every pound investment we've put in through VDLF, we to date have £6 return on that. So in terms of getting private sector or grant funding or so forth, basically every pound of VDLF has generated £6 investment, which I think is really good, in terms of what the council could expect. That's anticipated to fall to £4, and again, that's a lot to do with increasing construction costs and so forth. But again, it's still a really good return. Sorry, last one, if that's okay, or sorry, last 3. So this is just some kind of examples. So this was in Strathclyde Business Park, vacant and derelict land site, called Western Campus. Again, this was done over, and what we've been really successful in doing is, because VDLF comes in single years, we've actually been able to build on that. So, first year might be the acquisition of the site, second year may be the land remediation, and then the third year may be the enabling works to bring that kind of private sector in. This one was again funded through Spruce. So the loan funding for the actual construction works came from a private sector developer, CBC, but the funding actually, loan funding for this came from Spruce, and this was actually, has now been sold on. So this is actually had almost a 20% profit came in for Fusion Assets in this one. Next slide, please. So this is one that Fusion Assets are currently working on. So this is phase 1 of Gartcosh Industrial Business Park, where there's been 1 completion and fully let. There's 2 development are now completed, still to be let. This is phase 1. There's actually 4 phases on this. So phase 2, the enabling work is already taking place on this. and phase 3 and 4 are actually in development right now. And the last slide, please. So this was one where I was kind of highlighting that it's a wee bit different in this one, where we did all the enabling works and so forth, and then Regeneration Capital Grant Fund became available. So this was funded through that grant fund. So Fusion, rather than letting this and then selling it on, actually retain this, and they, again, it's fully leased, and it basically supports their operational model. There's a second phase of this to go ahead, and that's due to kick off later in this year. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was really interesting. I love that you've been able to put that figure on it, that really clear understanding of what the kind of return on investment is of £6 per pound. That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to move to Reni next. Reni works for Moray Council as Economic Growth and Regeneration Manager, leading a wide range of economic development activities. So welcome, Reni. Thank you very much for coming along. If anybody has any questions as we go along, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll pick them up with the three speakers at the end of their presentations. Okay, Reni, over to you now.
Thank you very much. Could you start the slideshow, please? That's splendid. And if you click again, you can see I will be talking about pop-up shops. We launched the first pop-up shop scheme as part of the Keys Regeneration or Conservation Area scheme, part funded by HES. Can you go to the next slide, please? And one of the issues was that at the time, Keys had the highest vacancy rate, which was around just under 13% of retail units. And we worked in partnership with the local regeneration group and basically rented from property owners shops which were in a good condition, but at no cost, and offered it to any startup businesses for an average of 4 weeks, and they had to pay utility bills. It was highly successful. We ran it for 2 years, and 23 startup businesses participated. Actually, it operated out of 2 different shops because the first one was then taken up permanently. Of those businesses, also not only 3 stayed in Keys and opened shops, but a lot of them also set up shops in other areas. And recently we followed it up, and it was amazing. We found 10 shops still operating, not just in Moray, but also in Aberdeenshire. It all resulted in 2016. Keys Mid Street had now the lowest vacancy rate in Moray. Now, pop-up shops, they can be run basically by any group, individual, or public bodies. And a good example for that is during the pandemic, Fintornby Arts Company, which has in Forest a shop front office, they actually offered it to local grown food suppliers and one bakery supply as a pop-up shop for 2 to 3 days. And what they used was also a very clever way of promotion by using street artists, whether it was stilt walker or somebody painting on the pavement. And again, the feedback was tremendous, that other shops commented that when usually the pop-up shop was operational, they actually saw an increase in people attending. Next slide, please. Now, I should say Fintornby Arts also then became Scotland Love's local hero because of all their fantastic efforts. So in 2020, as part of the economic recovery plan, Council agreed to actually roll out pop-up shop scheme in all the towns in Moray. And that came along with a budget of 50,000 because one has to have some money available, whether it's for legal fees and any other eventualities plus promotion. However, it was easier all said than done. And then we went into full lockdown, and we finally managed to start up at the end of 2021. And it generated, interestingly enough, a lot of publicity, including national publicity, which was very encouraging in terms of like startup businesses coming forward. And so far we had 61 who would like to participate. Not all of them are probably appropriate. So we declined like anybody who does online shops, because the aim is to create greater footfall in the town centres, whilst, you know, making use of empty shop properties. The first ones were open in Buckie in February. Next slide, please. And both actually had a very, very good time, and both of them are actually now seeking permanent premises to set up. One would love to stay in the shop. It's mega deal where he dealt from in Buckie. The other one hoping to really quite to Elgin. In Elgin, we're shortly starting pop-up shops. They are using our own business gateway offices. And again, needless to say, with Elgin being the main town, being the one with the highest demands. Next slide, please. For anybody who has participated in the pop-up shop schemes, we also have a budget to offer grants up to 10,000 at an intervention rate of 50%. And again, we did that very much in mind that new businesses right now finding it very difficult to get loans or any kind of grants to set up. And we felt that it's really important to have that, whether it's like people needing signage, you know, or needing to make any other changes to any properties. Now, there wasn't the time to really show you all the promotional material, from leaflets for traders to detailed information for property owners, but we are very happy to email it out to anybody who would like more information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Reni. That was great, really interesting, and a project that can clearly be replicated elsewhere. It's really fantastic to see that 2-year turnaround from the highest unoccupancy rate to the lowest in just 2 years. Really incredible, as somebody's commented in the chat as well. So I'm going to move to our third and final speaker for this session, which is Jamie. Jamie has recently taken on a role as lead officer for Dumfries and Galloway's local housing strategy, and is responsible for their £1 million town centre living fund, which aims to offer more affordable housing within walking distance. Jamie's also working on the development of a vacant and derelict land strategy for the local authority, and the development of a large-scale regeneration project to improve one of the most deprived parts of his region, which sounds like a really varied and interesting job. Thanks for joining us, Jamie, this morning.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to present to the group today. Looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. Again, if you'd like to ask any questions, folks, then please just pop that in the chat as we go along, but I'll also ask again at the end of Jamie's presentation. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to try and operate this myself and present at the same time. So hopefully everybody can see my screen at the moment. Emma's nodding, so I'll take that as a yes. So thanks very much for inviting me to present today. It's obviously a very exciting subject, something I'm really interested in personally and professionally. So just to give you a little bit of background, as Emma said, I work for Dumfries and Galloway Council. We are a stock transfer authority, so all our housing projects we work in partnership with resident social landlords and community groups to try and deliver. Obviously, come today to talk to you particularly about town centres and vacant and derelict land. So just to give a little bit of context to the region for everybody that may not be completely familiar with Dumfries and Galloway, very large region, one of the largest in Scotland, about 100 miles wide, 50 miles deep in particular places. And as you can see, we range right from Gretna, Langham in the east of the region, right across to Stranraer in the west. There's a population of around 150,000 people in Dumfries and Galloway. So obviously today the focus is on developing a strategy, and I thought it'd be helpful just to touch on some of the strategies that I'm involved in the development of, but also just to talk about why we develop a strategy. In terms of local housing strategy, most local authorities will recognise you have to. There's a statutory requirement to develop a local housing strategy. But there's also very good reasons to do that. It helps us to target funding through things like Strategic Housing Investment Plan, which comes from the Affordable Housing Supply Programme the Scottish Government provide, but also allows us to direct our own resources through things like the Town Centre Living Fund. And as Emma mentioned, I have begun work on the vacant and derelict land and property strategy for Dumfries and Galloway, which is completely new. We haven't ever developed a strategy on this basis before, so it's quite interesting to be involved in that work. Just talking quickly about the origins of our £1 million Town Centre Living Fund. Obviously recognise the cost of developing in town centres is very high, particularly when you're looking at vacant and derelict land. There's obviously a desire from elected members and the public to bring empty properties above shops back into use, but also recognising the declining demand for retail, which has only been exacerbated further given the recent pandemic. But the political will was obviously one of the key parts of that, and that really comes down to involving the community and helping them to drive forward some of those democratic decisions that are made. So just an early project here, Queen Street in Dumfries. This was a housing regeneration area that was designated by the council. And we went through a process of not just improving the private sector stock, but looking at the streetscape and linkages to the town centre. It connects to the main high street in Dumfries. And this particular building here was built on a gap site, a former derelict building that had been demolished. And also in the foreground there, you can see a garden that was been taken on by a local community group, developed again on a site of a cleared site, and they continue to maintain it. These properties were built in 2014. Moving on, this is a project in Langham former police station. Anybody who was at the Empty Homes Conference on Tuesday will be familiar with this one. It won the category for the best old wreck, I think it was the title. Our colleagues in South Scotland Community Housing were successful enough to support the delivery of this project, working with a local community group known as the Esdale Foundation to bring that back into use as 4 affordable homes. And what's quite interesting about this project, if you ever get a chance to see some of the photos, I'm happy to share them, is they're still using the cells, not as cells, they've been turned into bathrooms in these new homes. But this was supported through an allocation from the Town Centre Living Fund, Scottish Land Fund, Rural Housing Fund, and also South Scotland Enterprise, who have recently established themselves in Dumfries and Galloway and the borders. So just looking at some of the wider benefits the approach we're taking, Dumfries and Galloway, as many councils has declared a climate emergency. We have a very aspirational target to be net zero region by 2025, which I think is equal as most ambitious in Scotland. Also looking at economic sustainability, it's key to look at improving the built environment very much as well. And obviously what's becoming more and more apparent is this push around 20-minute neighbourhoods. Still trying to understand that completely in a rural context, but in some of our more urban settlements, it's obviously a great improvement and an opportunity there as well. So the Town Centre Living Fund again is focused on the town centres as defined in the local development plan within our region. There's the regional centre of Dumfries, larger town centres such as Stranraer, Annan, Castle Douglas and Newton Stewart, and then some smaller town centres in areas like Dalbeattie and Gretna. Wigton, where we've supported projects as well. Just coming on to highlight an early project. I'm not sure if many of you will be familiar with this from the photo, but this is actually the early iterations of the Midsteeple Quarter project, where they looked to take on the baker's oven, as it was known in Dumfries at the time. It was brought to the council's attention as a potential community asset transfer. The council has actually bought that building as a potential opportunity to look at a regeneration project, working with the retail sector, but unfortunately that never progressed. So it made sense to try and involve local community and deliver some of these aspirations. And now this is probably more familiar if you've seen any of the publicity around the Midsteeple Quarter. Master plan for that area of Dumfries High Street has now been agreed by the council, with a vision to provide homes and commercial spaces. But the main thing around this is the artist-led approach that's been taken here, and the community aspiration that's been delivered. The council's really taken an enabling role here by providing some seed funding at an early stage through the Town Centre Living Fund. Now worked up to a project where the building that I just showed you has been predominantly demolished, with the frontage retained, and the works are due to commence fairly soon in terms of rebuilding on that site and providing houses and enterprise spaces. Also linking into strategic housing investment plan, this site was a derelict site within the town centre of Annan, former agriculture and county store. They relocated to another site. Local community felt that this was a great opportunity to develop affordable housing, and the council worked in partnership with Cunningham Housing Association to bring this back into use. You can't see it in this picture, but there is an existing building that's within the conservation area that's also been turned into 5 flats. So total of 27 affordable homes on this site that have been, 5 of them are wheelchair accessible, right on the edge of the town centre, so people are able to just go straight in to support those shops and the local businesses as well, which I think is another strategic objective that's been delivered by this project. Just also looking at some community-led housing projects here. We do have a very active community housing approach in this region, supported by organisations like South Scotland Community Housing. Noticed one of the panellists earlier talking about the importance of revenue funding for a lot of these projects, and that's certainly something that we've recognised in Dumfries and Galloway. This was a project for a derelict building, been long-term derelict, unused for 30 years. Community again had identified it as an opportunity to bring it back into use, and now the project is delivering on 2 affordable homes in the former building, with a second phase looking at potentially bringing in some further homes towards the back of the site. Going on to vacant derelict land and property strategy, which I've recently been tasked with delivering, and I think there's quite a lot of interest in this now from things like the vacant derelict land investment plan being widened out. I know the fund was available to the 5 local authorities, predominantly in the central belt, that had the worst or the highest amounts of vacant derelict land. But we're looking for opportunities to try and utilise some of that funding. So that particular site you can see in the background there was the former Lochside Academy site, in between the new Lochside Academy and the town centre. And again, the local community felt that was a great opportunity for affordable housing and retaining working people in our region. This is the site now, fully developed, 45 affordable homes. This was on an opening event, hence why there's so many people standing in the picture there. Cunningham Housing Association again have developed this into high quality homes. As you can see, good gardens, good space, and highly energy efficient properties, again within walking distance to the town centre. And the Town Centre Living Fund was utilised to try and support this development. It was very costly, very expensive, but it does provide all those strategic benefits. And it may not necessarily provide a great example of value for money, but what it certainly does is highlights all those strategic benefits of taking this approach. And I think that with a more nuanced approach to value for money, it certainly would highlight some of the benefits of taking this approach. Also, just to quickly touch on Lochside Regeneration, I appreciate that's slightly out of focus, apologies for that, but this picture I felt was quite helpful just to highlight some of the approaches we're taking on the basis of some of the recommendations made recently by the Scottish Land Commission around pooling of assets. Dumfries and Galloway Council own the areas in green in this picture. Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership own the properties in blue. And the intention with the Lochside is effectively to pool all our resources in a site that's probably the most deprived in Dumfries and Galloway and one of the most deprived in Scotland. You see these are some of the properties here, fairly unattractive to people in Dumfries and Galloway. While there's still significant housing demand, these properties are predominantly 3-bedroom flats and are not something that people are particularly looking to live in. So we're looking at some multiple different benefits of taking this approach, including bringing the private sector into Dumfries and Galloway in terms of construction. We don't have a lot of large construction companies working in this region, so we're trying to leverage that into the region to provide jobs, improve the area, carry out major regeneration works, but also looking at how we better link Lochside with the rest of Dumfries. It's around 1.5 miles from the town centre. And there's certainly opportunities, given its location, to try and improve a lot of the facilities that are provided within Lochside. That was my final slide. So I will just try and stop sharing and bring back in Emma.
Thanks, Jamie. That was great, and a wide variety of case studies there and projects that people can learn from you about. Really fascinating to hear about that. Thank you. So please do put your questions in the chat, folks. The challenges that have been talked about today are significant and they're quite diverse, but we've heard about some real success stories in making progress in dealing with land reuse, vacant derelict land. So it's really good to take this opportunity to ask a few questions of those that have spoken to us. I'll kick it off though. We have heard about a lot of the successes today, and people listening might want to do what the things that you've been talking about doing today. So I just wanted to ask all of the panelists just to briefly tell me what their top tips would be for anybody who wanted to do the things that they had done, that they talked about today. Give us just 2 or 3 kind of key points from it. Let's start with you, Reni.
Thank you. For the pop-up shops, I highly recommend, if you work for a local authority, make sure you bring colleagues from all the other section departments around the table at an early stage. In particular, like property services, because there is obviously a high risk associated if the property is unchecked over. Also, legal services in terms of contract, while we have basically the contract with the property owner, but as soon they find a permanent let or sale, of course we leave, because the idea is that that helps also property owners to fill their vacant properties. But if you're operating it not as a public body, still I would advise that you check out everything before going ahead. And recommend also a small budget just in case a trader has forgotten to pay for their utility bills.
Thanks, Reni. Yes, I'm sure things like that must happen every now and again. Collaboration coming through there clearly from what you've been saying, and that's been a key theme throughout Land Reuse Month, actually. Yeah, thank you. David?
Sorry, a couple of things. So I think, it's recognising the public sector role in this. So we are about enabling rather than bringing this forward. I think it's also about de-risking, the site, particularly around vacant derelict land. There's major issues there, and I think the private sector, kind of gets scared until we're all ready to bring that in. I think it's about also expect the unexpected with vacant and derelict land, because there is major problems that do cost a lot of money. So this, particularly enabling investment is not about bringing forward profit. It's about getting this development ready and attracting the private sector into it. And I think the last one is probably pick the right site. You know what I mean? Because ultimately, you know, this has to work, you know, from our model, you know, in terms of fusion assets, it has to work as a commercially viable site.
Yeah, that's helpful as well, David. Thank you. Yeah, interesting to hear that. One of the things that's come through both the work that you've been doing and the work Reni's been doing has been about this idea of taking away risk. So understanding it, but then just trying to reduce it for people to give them the opportunity to take things forward themselves, but with that sort of balance of risk sort of being evened out a little bit. Thank you. Jamie, same question for you.
Yeah, thanks. I think Reni and David have made some great points there. You know, the public sector really has to take that approach that we're enabling. It's about enabling, but I think the message around collaboration is key. And you know, given the theme of this session is around developing a strategy, I think that strategic approach and making sure that communities are involved at an early stage, you get your elected members on board as well. The resources that you need to identify is obviously key. You know, we couldn't have done half of these projects without there being budgets out there for us to utilise and to use. And putting some seed funding in through the things like the Town Centre Living Fund really helps us as a council to target our partner organisations to actually look at developing in some of these places. Another point that David made as well about choosing your site being a key message. I think that is really important because you're going to have areas that there's greater opportunities. You're also going to have areas where there's probably less risk to the vacant and derelict land and less of an impact on communities. So we can't scatter ourselves with our limited resources right across the region. So we need to also prioritise what are the most important sites and what provides the most outcomes. So I think at an early stage of trying to prioritise which areas you want to see come back into use really helps.
Thanks, Jamie. That takes me nicely into a question here, actually, which is about how, you know, the funding issue keeps coming up again and the resources element to this. So the issue of the additional cost to developing vacant and derelict land, how do we make the case for addressing that? How do we make the case for investing in vacant and derelict land? And is there scope for costs to come down as land use becomes more mainstream and we see more of it happening? I'll go to Reni first.
Thank you. Whilst personally not so much dealing with derelict land, but we have run quite a number of large-scale regeneration schemes, and it has been always good to be ready in terms of like developing projects in partnership. So when funding opportunities presented themselves, whether it has been lottery funding, basically any funding, to be quite frank, including sponsorship and so on, to be ready and not at the starting point, you know, where funding becomes available and you scramble something together. That development phase is, I think, key to the success to attract funding.
Thank you. And Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. So it would be ideal if there's a way to bring the cost down. I think in terms of development, I don't know if that's something that we've got fully within our control given everything that's going on. But I think that, you know, looking at things like MPF4, the draft that's been produced around trying to incentivise through policy approach, the bringing back into use vacant and derelict land. I think that's, you know, that's something that will help and almost putting a deterrent on developing on greenfield in a way. What we're trying to do in Lochside, though, is by collectively pooling that land together, we're trying to drive greater economic benefits through that as well. So that effectively, rather than say a DGHP or the council looking at our own land in isolation, it's offering an opportunity to do things on a scale where we get better returns in terms of our investment. The whole project will probably provide massive benefits, but if we're to do it in isolated pockets, it makes it challenging. it's not something that's replicable everywhere, though. You know, we can do that in Dumfries, but I couldn't then necessarily go and take the same approach in Wigton. So we're always looking for new ideas as well. But opportunities for economies of scale really do help, and we're always trying to drive down costs. But in terms of housing development, we're also looking to improve the quality as well. So the two don't always lend themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. The Commission has a tool actually, which is about how you can assess the wider benefits of land reuse projects. Maybe one of my colleagues could pop that in the chat in case that's of interest to people who are thinking about that element of what you just said there. David, over to you.
So, and we've in North Lanarkshire been quite lucky in the sense that we've had the vacant derelict land fund since 2004, basically. So we've had that kind of investment to address the problem. I think what's been really useful in particular with the Scottish Government is that they've allowed us to start to marry up, money. So we've got the place-based investment programme, we've had the town centre fund, and we've been able to marry that up with vacant derelict land fund. So actually to do all this and actually almost be able to say we've got 100% funding coming forward with projects and not having to try and go to HLF or go to other places, where the timescales don't marry up, because that's always made it difficult. Marrying up Scottish Government funding from different, funding pots has actually been really useful for us.
Thanks, David. That's helpful. So we've got this complex funding landscape, but actually in part that's enabled you to match things together and create a coherent picture. Okay, and a bit of advice for funders there actually as well about how they can perhaps adapt to those timescales, maybe, and amend things slightly to make things easier. Great, thank you. The next question is one rather dear to my heart, which is about how do you engage communities in the developments, and perhaps also in the strategic planning element of this as well would be good to hear. Maybe one thing that works well and one thing that you found as being a particular challenge would be great to hear. If I go to Jamie first this time.
Thanks, Emma. That's something we're obviously is key to a lot of the developments we've taken forward in Dumfries and Galloway. And I think David mentioned it before, that our role is really as enablers. So a lot of the time the community have their aspirations around housing developments and wider issues as well, to try and tackle depopulation or to try and identify affordable homes for young people in their area. So in terms of things like the development of a strategy, my advice would certainly be have them involved right from the outset, work with them very closely, identify what their priorities are. You need to have some realistic discussions with them around what can and can't be done, but making sure they're there from the very outset. The Lochside proposal, we're intending on establishing a local delivery group, which we made up of community representatives and tenants organisations from that area. And effectively, the work won't start until that local delivery group is set up and has decided what route we want to go down. While that proposal has been agreed by our elected members, we have highlighted that it's going to be throughout the process. This is going to be entirely driven by communities, and that our role is really just to enable that, give the policy direction, identify the funding, set out the strategic priorities from a council as well. But that's what we really see as key to actually delivering any sort of success, is making sure the communities are on board right from the outset. But just a short point on that is, if the local people and communities are involved from the outset, you will be pushing an open door with elected members as well to get their agreement, and whether that be local councillors or MSPs, because they'll understand that that's their electorate and that's who they want to be supporting as well.
Thanks, Jamie. Thinking about just getting everybody on board, I guess it's quite a complicated picture of stakeholders that you're dealing with. So I think that's really interesting what you just said about the elected members there in particular at the end. And David, over to you.
I think what worked really well for us, we've actually quite changed quite recently. So rather than everything going to committee and you have to have that whole 8-week cycle coming in, we've now got delegated authority through boards. So we can actually move really quickly. So a lot of the work I do is about town centres, and when a potential high prime kind of property comes available, we're actually able to move on that really, really quickly, because we can just get the delegated authority through the board. So the whole structure of the council's kind of changed in the last couple of years, and to be able to do that, I think what's probably worked less well is we've went to community boards, and quite often you will have people with their own agenda. They'll come forward, So it's also how you bypass that and almost say, this is collectively as a community, we want to take this forward, and it's not just whoever shouts the loudest basically gets away. So good points and bad points.
It's never easy, is it? That's for sure. You've got a lot of things to balance. Yeah, absolutely. Reni, over to you.
I got the easy one, because I can say I can echo precisely what everybody else said. Key has been always for us to involve the community, regardless what type of project it has been, whether it's like Town Centre Capital Fund and so on. And the challenge is always that you've got individuals with their personal shopping list, and it's trying to balance it and making sure that you get those who shout loudest still involved, but redirect or quiet it down. It doesn't always work, but we certainly try. So, and yes, I think, again, it doesn't matter what type of project you're running or you secure funding for. It's not only for funders, they would like to see evidence that it hasn't been just a one-off consultation, that the community is actually fully involved in projects, and also key, to get council approval.
Emma, could I just come in and add another point there, because I think David and Reni have made some very good points. And it's certainly with community-led housing, what we tend to find is that it's often retired people on boards who want to try and drive the affordable housing. That's great, they've got the time to do that. What we've done in Dumfries and Galloway recently is recognised around succession planning for those boards, but also the importance of involving young people, given that a lot of these housing projects are going to be what they're living in the future. So my recommendation, and what we've done in Dumfries and Galloway, is gone out and identified the people within the council who have responsibility to involve young people in the decision-making process, like youth work services and our youth council in Dumfries and Galloway. So often it's going and just having conversations within your own organisation, or who's responsible for involving these other people and making sure that it isn't just the person who shouts the loudest or the person who has the time to do it, but how do we involve the people that are actually going to be impacted by this work at the end of the day.
Thanks, Jamie. I don't know if David or Reni want to come back at all on.
Yes, I certainly can say it worked really well in one of the large Castle Cathedral to Kashmir projects, and we approached the local college, Moray College, and involved them, because we were looking at, it was heritage related, and the challenge is always to involve younger people in heritage, and that was highly successful, and they took a very active role throughout the project.
Thank you. Some really good examples of community engagement on our website, but also out there in the wider world as well. Plenty of case studies around. If anyone's got any good examples that they'd like to post in the chat, then that would be lovely to hear from people. Were you going to come back on that, David, at all?
Just a quick one. So we've recently launched our town visions, which approved by committee. I know this is no digression from vacant and derelict land, from my subject, but so we have had a lot of individuals coming back on certain towns. So rather than going to the board and just having who comes along to be that kind of subgroup for our town visions and our town action plans, we are now looking for focus groups in those certain areas, so that we get the full spectrum of young people, old people, and that kind of involvement, that wider involvement. So we are particularly going to focus on schools, colleges, and workers as well on it.
Thank you. This theme's obviously chiming with people, because we had a couple more questions on community engagement come up as well. One of them I think has pretty much been covered by the discussion, but this other one from Laura says, has anyone had a community partner who has led on the community engagement aspect of a project? And did this result in different engagement than when the local authority leads? It's an interesting question, I think. How about I come to Jamie first on this one?
Yeah, we were involved in a large-scale restoration project of a wool mill, Nokanda wool mill, and it was a community trust. It was actually an interesting, complex project, trying to take over the asset from a private owner. And the council was basically the support, and with the job also to secure European funding, and which was a challenge, was a 3.5 million project. And yes, the community engagement was very different, and was, I suppose, important that the local community trust was leading it and not a public body. Whether the outcome would have been extremely different, I'm not too sure, but I'm pretty sure that because it was such a rural area, the locals, you know, were very supportive. But by sometimes when you come in as a local authority, there is a little bit of suspicion, you know, and it made it easier. So in short, the project was highly successful, funded with loads of different trusts, but main fund is Europe and Heritage Lottery Fund, with support from Historic Environment Scotland. Probably a good example of how you can create a change. However, it took years and years and years from concept to actually the grand opening of the wool mill with, you know, interpretation, coffee shop, and so on.
Thanks, Reni. That's helpful. Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we've got a great example in Dumfries town centre itself, the Midsteeple Quarter, where again the council took a step back, and we tried to enable it was the Stove Network at the time to go out and do that community consultation around what they wanted to see in Dumfries town centre in particular, and effectively they're far better place to go out and do that community consultation. I think a lot of the times when people see either the council or a registered social landlord as a professional organisation, they don't engage as well as if they're seeing somebody who's also a volunteer or also feels more like one of themselves. So the Midsteeple Quarter, through the funding with the Town Centre Living Fund, part of it was around developing a business plan for the community asset transfer of that building, but also a big part of it was around the community engagement, and they held a number of different events, involved local communities, set up a community group as well through that, known as Dumfries High Street Limited. But they managed to engage with around 700 people, carrying out surveys, whether that was through pop-up shops actually in that existing building, going out and doing publicity online. And I think that's something we really want to make sure they're more involved in. But what that's also done, I know there was an earlier discussion on community wealth building, is the Stove Network are now widening out the scope of their consultation work and almost becoming a professional organisation around that, working on the projects. I'm sure some of you are familiar. I think it's called Cultural Creative, which is looking at art-based regeneration for different areas across the whole of Scotland, and they've been successful in getting funding from the Scottish Government. So I'm not taking the credit for this, but we certainly hopefully give them a gentle bit of support in the right place. That's meant that they're now, we're actually looking at this organisation potentially delivering far greater consultation across more regeneration areas in Dumfries and Galloway, and because we don't have those resources in this region as it stands. So how do we support them further to really carry on that work? So yeah, the community are a far better place to do the community consultation than I think I am as a council officer.
Jamie, David?
So I'm going to be a wee bit slightly negative in this one. Sorry.
I wondered if you might.
So in terms of, we have had quite a lot of regeneration capital grant fund bid going in, and what tends to happen is there's a 2-year gap between stage 1 going in before stage 2 is like actually completed and contract signed, and costs have just spiraled recently, and it tends to be that the council has to pick up the gap on this. So I think that going forward, and we're fully supportive of community groups coming forward and delivering stuff, but we have to have realistic budgets in terms of going forward, and they can't just always be that the council picks up that kind of gap. And I have to say, Scottish Government's been really good in the last year in terms of meeting those kind of gaps, but it's always us, going forward and identifying here's a gap, and here's a problem here, and it comes on the council. And realistically, if it's community led and it's sustainable and so forth, the community has to build that in. So I think, going forward, we will be building so much contingency in for future bids, to make sure that, because it's ultimately it's public money, that comes here, and we have to meet that gap. So sorry, I don't mean to be negative on it, but we have had a problem, in the last couple of years.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. It's about getting those expectations right, isn't it? In part, we're talking to communities about the right things at the right time, and finding that balance of things. Okay, so thank you so much to our panelists today, Jamie, David and Reni. We really appreciate your time and your contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you.